Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ghost Returns. Greg Hull adjusted his black tie in the rearview mirror of his rental car, staring at the weathered face that looked back at him. For years of sleeping in shelters, eating at soup kitchens, and working odd jobs had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes. But beneath the surface of apparent defeat, something darker burned, a patience that had been forged in the crucible of absolute loss. The funeral home parking lot was packed with expensive cars, a stark reminder of the wealth he'd once known. Greg had grown up in the Hull family mansion, heir to a construction empire built by 3 generations of Hull men. His father, Harold Hull, had been a titan in the industry, owning everything from concrete plants to luxury resort developments across 3 states. Greg had worked alongside him since he was 16, learning every aspect of the business, earning his place as the natural successor. That was before his brother Chad had poisoned everything. Chad Hull had always been the charming one, quick with a smile, faster with a lie. While Greg buried himself in blueprints and construction schedules, Chad had focused on networking and politics. He'd married early to a senator's daughter, giving him connections Greg never thought to cultivate. When their mother died 10 years ago, Chad had started working on their father, planting seeds of doubt about Greg's instability and drinking problem, lies that grew into accepted truth through constant repetition. But the killing blow had come from the woman Greg had loved more than life itself. Lynette Hendricks had been Greg's college sweetheart, a psychology major with honey blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room. They'd been together for 8 years, married for 5, and Greg had never doubted her loyalty. She knew about the family tensions, had even defended Greg against Chad's subtle manipulations. Or so he'd thought. The day Greg discovered the truth still burned in his memory like acid. He'd come home early from a job site, wanting to surprise Lynette for their anniversary. Instead, he'd found her in their bed with Chad, moving together with the familiarity of longtime lovers. The confrontation that followed had been volcanic. Accusations, admissions, and the revelation that they'd been together for 2 years. "I never loved you," Lynette had said, her voice cold as winter steel. "You were just a placeholder until Chad was ready to leave his wife. You're weak, Greg. You always have been. Chad knows how to take what he wants." The divorce had been swift and brutal, with Chad's legal connections and Lynette's accusations of domestic violence. Lies, but convincing ones. Greg had lost everything. The family business went to Chad as Harold chose his stable son over his violent one. The house, the cars, the investments, all gone. Within 6 months, Greg Hull had been transformed from millionaire heir to homeless vagrant. Now, standing outside the funeral home where his father's body lay in state, Greg felt no grief, only the cold satisfaction of knowing his time for justice had finally arrived. He walked through the parking lot, noting the familiar faces through expensive car windows. Local politicians, business partners, society wives, all the people who had turned their backs on him when his fall from grace became public knowledge. They would all be inside, paying their respects to Harold Hull while carefully avoiding eye contact with his disgraced son. The funeral home's lobby was exactly as Greg remembered from his mother's service. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the cloying scent of too many flowers. He signed the guest book with steady hands, aware of the whispers that followed his movement through the crowd. "Is that really Greg Hull? I heard he's been living on the streets. Such a shame what happened to that family." Greg found his father's casket surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, most bearing cards from Chad's business associates. Harold Hull looked smaller in death, his weathered hands folded over his chest. Greg felt nothing as he stared down at the man who had chosen Chad's lies over his own son's truth. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Greg turned to see Chad approaching, looking every inch the successful businessman in his $1,000 suit. At 38, Chad had maintained his college quarterback physique, though his face had gained the soft smugness that came with unearned success. Behind him walked Lynette, now carrying the Hull name she'd schemed to claim. She'd barely changed, still beautiful, still cold, still wearing that calculating look Greg now recognized as her true nature. "Hello, Chad." "Lynette." Greg's voice was steady, betraying none of the rage that simmered beneath the surface. Chad's grin was all teeth and malice. "Still homeless and divorced?" "LMAO." He actually said the acronym out loud, as if Greg's suffering was nothing more than an internet joke. Lynette stepped closer, her perfume a cloying reminder of their shared past. "Hey, useless child," she said, using the pet name she'd once claimed was affectionate. "Still the same pathetic loser, I see." The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing drama. Greg could feel dozens of eyes watching, waiting for him to break, to give them the spectacle they'd come to expect from the fallen Hull brother. Instead, Greg smiled. Before he could respond, a distinguished voice cut through the tension. "Perfect timing. I have something important to tell you." Matthew Jackson, the Hull family lawyer for 30 years, had appeared beside them with a manila envelope in his weathered hands. The elderly attorney's face was grave as he looked between the three of them. "Perhaps we should step into the private viewing room," Jackson continued. "What I have to say concerns the reading of Harold's will, and I believe it requires immediate attention." Greg watched Chad's face shift from smugness to confusion, while Lynette's eyes narrowed with the sharp calculation he remembered so well. They thought they knew what was coming. Another humiliation for Greg, another victory for their twisted partnership. They had no idea that Greg Hull had spent 4 years planning for this exact moment. Chapter 2. The Foundation of Betrayal. 5 years earlier, Greg Hull had been living what most people would consider a perfect life. As vice president of Hull Construction, he managed a company worth over $50 million, overseeing projects from luxury condominiums to government infrastructure contracts. His marriage to Lynette seemed solid, built on 8 years of shared history and mutual ambition. They lived in a sprawling estate in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, hosted dinner parties for business associates, and talked about starting a family. Greg had been naive enough to believe it was real. The first crack in his perfect world had come during a family dinner at the Hull mansion. Chad had been discussing his divorce from Senator Morrison's daughter, Patricia, claiming irreconcilable differences. Greg had offered his support, even suggesting Chad move into their guest house until he found his own place. "That's generous of you, brother," Chad had said with what Greg now recognized as calculated sincerity. "But I think I need to be completely independent. Fresh start and all that." Harold had nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, son. A man needs to stand on his own 2 feet. Greg had noticed how his father used son when addressing Chad, while he himself rarely received more than a grunt of acknowledgement. It had stung, but Greg had attributed it to Chad's recent emotional trauma. That same evening, Lynette had been unusually quiet during the drive home. When Greg asked if something was wrong, she'd turned to him with an expression he'd never seen before, something calculating and cold. "Do you ever wonder if you're living the right life?" she'd asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sure you're with the right person? In the right family position? Sometimes I think people settle for what's comfortable instead of fighting for what they really want." Greg had laughed, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I've got everything I want right here." But Lynette had pulled her hand away, staring out the window with that distant look that would become increasingly familiar over the following months. The betrayal had been methodical and thorough. While Greg focused on running the day-to-day operations of Hull Construction, Chad worked on their father's perception of reality. Family dinners became opportunities for Chad to subtly undermine Greg's decisions, questioning his judgment on projects and highlighting every minor setback as evidence of deeper problems. "I'm worried about Greg, Dad," Chad would say with feigned concern. "He's been making some questionable calls lately." The Morrison project was 3 weeks behind schedule because of his miscalculations. It was weather delays, Greg would protest, but Harold's trust had already begun to erode. Meanwhile, Lynette had become increasingly distant, claiming work stress and scheduling conflicts that kept her away from home. Greg had been concerned enough to suggest marriage counseling, but she dismissed the idea with a laugh. "Not everything needs to be fixed, Greg. Sometimes people just grow apart." The lies had been everywhere, but Greg had been too trusting to see them. Chad would show up at their house when Greg was at work, ostensibly to borrow tools or check on Lynette after Greg mentioned she'd been feeling unwell. Lynette would return from girls' nights, smelling like cologne that wasn't Greg's, with explanations that made perfect sense individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when examined together. The business had suffered as Greg became increasingly distracted by his crumbling personal life. A missed deadline here, a cost overrun there. Nothing catastrophic, but enough for Chad to build a case that Greg was becoming unreliable. Harold had started calling Chad directly about projects, bypassing Greg entirely. "I think you need a vacation," Harold had said during what would be their last private conversation. "Chad can handle things for a few weeks while you get your head on straight." Greg had protested, but Harold's mind was made up. The old man's eyes held a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. The final revelation had come on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. Greg had left work early, driving home with flowers and champagne to surprise Lynette for their 5th wedding anniversary. The house had been quiet when he'd entered, but he'd heard sounds from upstairs, soft voices and movement from their bedroom. The door had been partially open, giving him a perfect view of his wife and brother moving together with practiced intimacy. They weren't just having sex. They were making love with the familiarity of a long-established couple. Watching them, Greg had realized this wasn't a recent affair. It was a relationship that had been growing for months, possibly years. The confrontation had been brutal. Chad had been arrogant, claiming he'd won the better woman, while Lynette had been viciously honest about her true feelings. "You were always the placeholder," she'd said, pulling on Chad's shirt with casual intimacy. "The safe choice while I figured out what I really wanted. Chad has ambition, connections, vision. You're just a worker bee who inherited a crown you never deserved." The divorce proceedings had been swift and merciless. Chad's political connections had provided Lynette with a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes family court cases. Her claims of emotional and physical abuse, all lies, but convincingly delivered, had swayed a judge who seemed predisposed to believe the beautiful victim over the angry husband. Harold had refused to support Greg publicly, claiming he didn't want to take sides in family matters. But privately, he made his choice clear by promoting Chad to president of Hull Construction and removing Greg from all decision-making authority. "You're not thinking clearly," Harold had said during their final argument. "A man who can't control his own household can't be trusted to run a business." Within 6 months, Greg had lost everything: his wife, his family business, his home, and his father's respect. Chad and Lynette had married in a lavish ceremony at the country club where Greg had once been a member. The guest list had included everyone from Greg's former life, all celebrating the triumph of the golden couple over the fallen prince. But what they didn't know was that Greg Hull had inherited more than just a construction company from 3 generations of Hull men. He'd inherited their patience, their ability to plan, and their absolute ruthlessness when dealing with enemies. Over the past 4 years, while living in shelters and working menial jobs, Greg had been planning something that would make his brother and ex-wife understand the true meaning of loss. Chapter 3: The Reading of Vengeance. The private viewing room felt like a courtroom as Matthew Jackson arranged his papers on the mahogany table. Chad sat with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, while Lynette maintained the composed mask she perfected over 4 years of high society marriage. Greg remained standing by the window, appearing calm despite the hurricane of anticipation building in his chest. "Before we begin," Jackson said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I should note that Harold made several significant changes to his will in the weeks before his death. These modifications were made with full legal capacity and proper witnesses." Chad leaned forward. "What kind of changes, Matthew?" "Nothing too dramatic, I hope." The lawyer's expression remained neutral. "I'll read the relevant sections verbatim, as Harold requested." He opened the official document, cleared his throat, and began. "To my son Chad Hull, who has spent the past 4 years believing himself to be my heir and successor, I leave the sum of $100,000 and my collection of fishing equipment. This bequest comes with my recognition of his success in deceiving an old man who should have been wiser." Chad's face went white. "What the hell does that mean?" Jackson continued reading. "To Lynette Hull, nay Hendricks, who married into my family through lies and manipulation, I leave nothing. She has already taken more than her share. Lynette shot to her feet. This is impossible. Harold loved me like a daughter. I was the only one who visited him regularly in his final months. Please sit down, Mrs. Hull, Jackson said firmly. There's more. Greg felt his pulse quicken as the lawyer turned to the next page. To my son, Greg Hull, who I wronged through my own blindness and pride, I leave my sincere apology and the entirety of my estate, including all business holdings, properties, and investments, valued at approximately $68 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad's mouth moved soundlessly while Lynette gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. Furthermore, Jackson continued, I direct my executor to inform Greg that the safety deposit box at First National Bank contains materials that will be of great interest to him. The contents were compiled with the assistance of private investigator Raphael Owen, whom I hired after discovering certain discrepancies in information I had been given about my sons. Chad finally found his voice. This is insane. The old man was clearly suffering from dementia. We'll contest this will so fast, it'll make your head spin. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Jackson replied calmly. Harold underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation just 2 weeks before his death. Dr. Amanda Chung declared him to be of completely sound mind and judgment. Her report is part of the official file. Greg spoke for the first time since entering the room. Tell them about the investigation, Matthew. The lawyer nodded grimly. Harold hired Raphael Owen 18 months ago after becoming suspicious about certain claims made regarding Greg's character and behavior. Owen's report makes for fascinating reading. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to the first page. For instance, the domestic violence claims made during the divorce proceedings were thoroughly debunked. Owen interviewed 3 witnesses who were present during the alleged incidents. All confirmed they never occurred. Lynette's face had gone pale. You can't prove anything. Those were sealed court records. Owen is very thorough, Jackson continued. He also documented the affair between Chad and Lynette, which began approximately 18 months before Greg discovered it. Hotel records, credit card statements, witness testimonies, quite comprehensive. Chad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So what? We're all adults here. People fall in love. True, Greg said, finally turning from the window. But corporate fraud is a different matter entirely. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chad's swagger cracked slightly. What fraud? I've never. Sit down, Chad. Greg's voice carried an authority that made his brother comply instinctively. Let Matthew finish reading. Jackson turned to another section of the report. Owen discovered that Chad had been systematically overbilling clients and skimming profits for nearly 3 years. The money was hidden in offshore accounts established under false names. The total amount appears to be just over $4 million. That's impossible, Chad protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence includes bank records, forged invoices, and testimony from 3 employees who were aware of the scheme but afraid to come forward, Jackson continued. One of them, Stuart Gleason from the accounting department, kept detailed records as insurance against being blamed himself. Lynette was staring at Chad with growing horror. You told me that money came from successful investments. It did come from investments, Chad said desperately. I invested in the company's future by stealing from it, Greg interrupted. By betraying everything our grandfather and father built. By proving that you're exactly the parasite I always suspected you were. Chad lunged toward Greg, but stopped when the door opened to admit 2 men in suits. Gentlemen, Jackson announced, meet Detectives Wayne Farley and Aaron Stevens from the Financial Crimes Division. They've been very interested in Mr. Owen's findings. Detective Farley stepped forward with handcuffs visible on his belt. Chad Hull, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning continued, Chad's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, desperate terror. Lynette backed against the wall, her perfectly composed mask finally cracking to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath. This isn't over, Chad snarled as the handcuffs clicked shut. I'll fight this. I'll prove you set me up. Greg smiled for the first time in 4 years, a cold, predatory expression that made everyone in the room take a step back. Oh, brother, he said softly. We're just getting started. As the detectives led Chad away, Lynette turned to Greg with something approaching her old seductive smile. Greg, honey, you have to understand, I was trapped. Chad threatened me, controlled me. I never wanted to hurt you. Greg looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman he'd once loved enough to forgive anything. Then he thought about 4 years of sleeping in shelters while she lived in luxury, built on stolen money and lies. Lynette, he said gently, in about 30 minutes, you're going to receive a visit from the IRS. Turns out when you file joint tax returns with someone who's hiding millions in offshore accounts, you become liable for the unpaid taxes. The penalties and interest should wipe out whatever assets you might have claimed in the divorce. Her mask finally shattered completely. You bastard. You planned this whole thing. I planned nothing, Greg replied. I simply waited for the truth to surface, then made sure it reached the right people. Justice isn't revenge, Lynette. It's just accounting. As she stormed out, Greg turned back to Matthew Jackson, who was organizing his papers with the satisfaction of a job well done. There's one more thing, Greg, the lawyer said. Your father left you a personal letter. He wanted you to read it alone. Greg took the sealed envelope with hands that barely trembled. After 4 years of careful planning and patient waiting, Harold Hull would finally have the last word. Chapter 4. The Letter and the Plan. Greg waited until he was completely alone in his hotel room before opening his father's letter. The envelope bore Harold's distinctive handwriting, still strong despite his 73 years. Inside, 3 pages of thick stationery carried words that Greg had waited 4 years to hear. My son Greg, if you're reading this, then justice has finally been served, though far too late for my liking. I have no excuse for the blindness that allowed me to believe Chad's lies and doubt your character. A man my age should have been wiser, but perhaps the heart always wants to believe the more pleasant lie over the harder truth. Raphael Owen's investigation opened my eyes to the depth of Chad's deception and your innocence in all matters. The domestic violence claims were fabricated, the business failures were sabotaged, and your supposed drinking problem was a complete fiction. I failed you as a father by choosing to believe the son who told me what I wanted to hear over the son who showed me who he really was through his actions. But this letter is not just an apology, it's a roadmap. Owen's investigation uncovered far more than just Chad's corporate theft. I've spent the last 18 months documenting every lie, every manipulation, every crime committed against you and our family legacy. The safety deposit box contains evidence of additional schemes that go far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad has been using Hull Construction as a front for money laundering operations tied to his political connections. The Riverside Casino project was funded with dirty money from Pablo Pollard's organization, filtered through shell companies Chad established. The city contracts were secured through bribes paid to Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins. The entire operation is documented in the files. But Greg, I'm not asking you to simply turn this evidence over to authorities. I'm giving you the tools to destroy them completely, legally, financially, and socially. They took 4 years of your life through lies and manipulation. Take everything from them in return. Your loving father, Harold Hull. P.S. Felix William at the bank has been expecting you. The second safety deposit box contains something else you'll need. Greg set the letter down and walked to the hotel window, staring out at the city where he'd once been a prince and then a pauper. His father's words had lifted a weight he'd carried for 4 years, but they'd also confirmed something he'd suspected. Chad's crimes went far beyond simple theft. The next morning, Greg visited First National Bank. Felix William, a veteran banker with silver hair and knowing eyes, led him to the safety deposit boxes without small talk. The first box contained Raphael Owen's complete investigation files, hundreds of pages of evidence, photographs, financial records, and witness statements. The second box contained something that made Greg smile with genuine appreciation for his father's thorough planning. Cash. Nearly $2 million in untraceable bills, accumulated over 18 months from Harold's personal accounts. Attached was a note for expenses not covered by traditional legal channels. Greg spent the next week studying every document, understanding the full scope of Chad and Lynette's betrayal. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into city government, state politics, and organized crime. Chad hadn't just stolen from the family business. He turned it into a criminal enterprise. More importantly, Greg now understood why Lynette had targeted him so specifically. Her psychology degree hadn't been wasted. She'd been the perfect manipulator to identify his weaknesses and exploit them. The entire affair had been calculated from the beginning, designed to position Chad as the reliable heir while discrediting Greg completely. But Harold's investigation had revealed Lynette's true background as well. Her real name was Linda Henderson, and she'd been married twice before under different identities. Each marriage had ended with her husband losing substantial assets through suspicious circumstances. She was a professional predator who'd found the perfect mark in the whole family fortune. On the seventh day, Greg made his first move. He called Detective Wayne Farley and arranged a meeting at a discreet coffee shop downtown. Farley arrived looking skeptical until Greg began laying out documents that expanded the embezzlement case into something much larger. "Jesus Christ," Farley muttered, studying photographs of Chad meeting with known associates of Pablo Pollard. "How long has this been going on?" "At least 3 years," Greg replied. "Probably longer. Hull Construction has been washing money for multiple criminal organizations while also paying bribes for preferential city contracts. The Riverside Casino project alone involved $12 million in dirty money." Farley was a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of corruption, but this evidence was overwhelming in its scope and precision. "Why come to me?" he asked finally. "With evidence like this, you could go to the FBI, the state attorney general, anywhere." Greg leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a slight smile. "Because you arrested Chad based on my father's evidence. You've already committed to seeing this through. And because I want them to understand exactly how much they've lost before the federal agencies get involved." Over the next 2 weeks, Greg orchestrated a campaign of revelation that unfolded like a carefully planned military operation. Anonymous tips led reporters to offshore banking records. Suspicious activity reports triggered IRS investigations into multiple shell companies. Witness statements from former employees suddenly became public knowledge. Chad's arrest for embezzlement had been shocking enough. But as the web of corruption unraveled, it became clear that Hull Construction had been the center of a criminal conspiracy that touched dozens of public officials and business leaders. Lynette's true identity as Linda Henderson became front-page news when her previous marriage victims came forward with their stories. The beautiful widow who'd charmed high society was revealed as a serial predator who destroyed multiple families for financial gain. But Greg's masterstroke came when he arranged for Pablo Pollard to learn that Chad had been cooperating with police from the moment of his arrest. It wasn't true. Chad had maintained his innocence throughout, but Pollard didn't know that. The crime boss's organization had a reputation for handling informants with extreme prejudice. Greg made sure Chad learned about Pollard's displeasure while he was still in county jail awaiting federal charges. The fear in his brother's eyes during their first and only jail visit was worth 4 years of patient waiting. "You set me up," Chad whispered through the bulletproof glass. "You planned this whole thing." "I planned nothing," Greg replied calmly. "I simply documented your crimes and made sure the right people learned about them. Everything that's happening to you is the direct result of choices you made." Chad's face was gaunt from stress and fear. "Pollard's people are going to kill me." "Then you'd better hope the federal prosecutor offers you protective custody," Greg said, standing to leave. "Of course, that would require admitting to crimes you've spent weeks denying." "Wait," Chad called desperately. "What about Lynette? What are you going to do to her?" Greg paused at the door, considering the question. In truth, Lynette's destruction was already well underway through legal channels. Her assets frozen, her reputation ruined, her true identity exposed. But Chad didn't need to know that his ex-wife's fate was sealed. Lynette made her choice 4 years ago, Greg said finally. "She chose you over me because she thought you were the winner. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice." As Greg walked away from the jail, he felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. But this was only the beginning. The evidence he'd inherited from his father contained enough ammunition to destroy not just Chad and Lynette, but the entire network of corruption they'd built around themselves. Justice, Greg reflected, was indeed just accounting, and he intended to balance these books down to the last penny. Chapter 5. The Network Falls. 3 weeks after Chad's arrest, Greg sat in the renovated penthouse office that had once belonged to his father. Hull Construction was officially under federal oversight while the investigation continued, but Greg's inheritance as majority shareholder gave him control over day-to-day operations. His first act had been to hire Amanda Chung, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated his father, as the company's new chief ethics officer. His second had been to schedule individual meetings with every employee who'd remained silent about Chad's crimes. Stuart Gleason arrived first, nervous sweat beading on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. As the accounting manager who'd documented Chad's embezzlement, Stuart had been living in fear of retaliation for nearly 3 years. "Mr. Hull," Stuart began, "I want you to know I never wanted to be part of—" Greg raised a hand to stop him. "Stuart, you kept detailed records that helped expose my brother's crimes. That took courage, even if you were initially motivated by self-preservation." "I was terrified," Stuart admitted. "Chad threatened to frame me for the thefts if I ever said anything. He had connections everywhere: police, courts, politicians. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I understand. But now I need you to help me understand something else." Greg pulled out a file folder containing bank records and shell company documentation. "These accounts show money flowing to companies that don't seem to exist. Can you walk me through how Chad was hiding the money laundering operations?" Over the next hour, Stuart detailed a sophisticated network of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Chad had created a web of shell companies that existed only on paper, each designed to obscure the source and destination of illegal funds. Money from Pablo Pollard's criminal organization would enter through one company, be transferred through 6 others, then emerge as legitimate Hull Construction revenue. The genius of it, Stuart explained reluctantly, was that most of the individual transactions looked normal. A construction company receiving payment from subcontractors, paying suppliers, transferring funds for materials. Only when you mapped the entire network could you see it was all designed to wash dirty money. Greg nodded grimly. His brother had been more clever than he'd given him credit for, but cleverness without conscience was just another form of stupidity. That afternoon, Greg met with Detective Farley and 2 federal agents who'd joined the investigation. Agent Kirsten Levine from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Agent Eduardo Crow from the DEA had been tracking Pablo Pollard's organization for 3 years without realizing Hull Construction was part of his operation. "Your brother's cooperation has been limited," Agent Levine said diplomatically. "He maintains his innocence despite overwhelming evidence." "Chad always did have trouble accepting responsibility," Greg replied. "But I might be able to help you understand the full scope of the network." He provided them with Harold's complete files, including surveillance photographs of Chad meeting with Pollard's lieutenants, detailed financial records showing money transfers, and copies of coded communications between Hull Construction and various criminal enterprises. "This is incredible," Agent Crow muttered, studying photographs of Chad shaking hands with known drug dealers. "We've been trying to map Pollard's money laundering operation for years. This gives us everything we need." "There's more," Greg said. "The corruption extends into city government. Councilman Terry McKee and Planning Commissioner Hugh Higgins have been taking bribes to fast-track construction permits for projects funded with dirty money." Agent Levine looked up sharply. "Do you have evidence of that?" Greg pulled out audio recordings his father had made during the final months of his life. Harold had suspected the bribes and used his connections to document meetings between Chad and the corrupt officials. The recordings were damning. Chad's voice clearly discussing payments to McKee and Higgins in exchange for expedited permits, and zoning variances. The officials' voices equally clear in accepting the arrangements and discussing specific amounts. Jesus, Detective Farley breathed. This is going to bring down half the city government. Only the corrupt half, Greg corrected. The honest officials will remain to rebuild what's been damaged. Within 48 hours, the investigation had expanded to include federal racketeering charges. McKee and Higgins were arrested at their homes in pre-dawn raids, while Hull Construction's offices were searched by teams of federal agents collecting evidence of the money laundering conspiracy. The local media had a field day. Headlines screamed about corruption at City Hall, organized crime infiltration of legitimate businesses, and the stunning fall of one of the region's most prominent families. Chad's mugshot appeared on the front page of every newspaper, his once confident smile replaced by the hollow stare of a man facing life in federal prison. But Greg's attention was focused on a different target. Lynette had hired Kenneth Herman, one of the city's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, despite claiming poverty in her divorce filings. Greg knew she had to be drawing on hidden assets, money that represented her share of Chad's criminal profits. Through Raphael Owen, who'd remained on Greg's payroll after Harold's death, Greg learned that Lynette was living in a luxury apartment under her real name, Linda Henderson. She'd abandoned the pretense of being Chad's grieving wife and was preparing to disappear entirely once the heat died down. She'd done it before with previous husbands, vanishing with stolen assets while leaving behind devastated families. But this time, she'd underestimated her target. Greg arranged to meet her at the apartment through a carefully orchestrated deception. Owen had contacted her claiming to represent a potential buyer for information about Chad's hidden assets, information that would be valuable to either the government or Pablo Pollard's organization. When Lynette opened the door expecting a corrupt private investigator, she found Greg standing in the hallway with a briefcase and a cold smile. "Hello, Linda," he said, using her real name. "We need to talk." Her mask of composed beauty cracked instantly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "What do you want?" "Justice," Greg replied, stepping into the apartment uninvited, "and an accounting of everything you've stolen from my family." The apartment was expensively furnished with art and jewelry that couldn't have been purchased on Chad's legitimate salary. Greg recognized several pieces from their former home, items Lynette had claimed in the divorce settlement despite their connection to the Hull family heritage. "You can't prove anything," Lynette said, backing toward the bedroom where Greg assumed she kept either weapons or a go-bag for quick escapes. "Actually, I can prove everything." Greg opened the briefcase to reveal copies of financial records linking her to Chad's shell companies. "You weren't just his accomplice, Linda. You were his business partner from the beginning." The documents showed Lynette's real role in the conspiracy. She'd used her psychology background to identify potential corruption targets, manipulating city officials and business leaders into accepting bribes. Her charm and beauty had opened doors that remained closed to Chad's more obvious criminality. "You're going to prison," Greg continued calmly. "The only question is whether you serve your sentence in minimum security or maximum. That depends on how helpful you are to the federal investigators." Lynette's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she screamed. "Pablo Pollard doesn't forgive people who cooperate with police. Chad is already marked for death, and anyone who helps bring down his operation will be next. Then you'd better hope the FBI's witness protection program is as good as advertised," Greg replied, "because your only choice now is between federal prison and a shallow grave." As he left the apartment, Greg felt no satisfaction in Lynette's terror. She'd earned her fate through 4 years of choices that had destroyed innocent people for financial gain. Now she would face the consequences of those choices, just as Chad was learning to face his. But Greg's campaign of justice was far from over. The network of corruption his brother had built reached into organizations and institutions that would take months to unravel. Every thread needed to be followed, every crime documented, every criminal held accountable. The fallen prince was becoming the avenging angel, and his work had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Predator's Web. Raphael Owen's investigation into Lynette's background had uncovered a pattern that stretched back 15 years and crossed multiple state lines. Her real name was Linda Marie Henderson, but she'd operated under at least 6 different identities while systematically destroying the lives of wealthy men who'd made the mistake of trusting her. Greg studied the files in his restored office, each case folder representing a family devastated by Linda's manipulations. Her first victim had been Marcus Webb, a successful restaurant owner in Chicago. She'd married him under the name Lily Watkins, then divorced him after claiming domestic abuse and emptying his business accounts. Webb had committed suicide 6 months after losing everything, leaving behind 3 children who'd been turned against him through Linda's lies. The pattern was always the same. Identify a wealthy target, create a false identity, establish trust through charm and apparent vulnerability, then systematically isolate the victim from family and friends while gaining access to financial assets. The divorce would come with fabricated evidence of abuse, ensuring favorable settlements that left the men with nothing, while Linda disappeared with new identities and substantial wealth. She's not just a gold digger, Amanda Chung observed, reviewing the psychological profiles Raphael had compiled. She's a sociopathic predator who views human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded. Greg nodded grimly. The question is whether we can connect her to all these previous crimes. Most of the evidence is circumstantial, and some of these men are dead. Actually, Raphael said, I found something interesting. Linda made a mistake with her 4th victim, William Cross in Denver. She used the same social security number on 2 different marriage licenses, creating a paper trail that connects multiple identities. The implications were staggering. If they could prove Linda had committed marriage fraud across state lines, she'd face federal charges that could add decades to her sentence for the whole conspiracy crimes. Greg authorized Raphael to expand his investigation, using Harold's remaining cash reserves to dig deeper into Linda's criminal history. What they discovered over the next 2 weeks was even worse than they'd imagined. Linda hadn't just stolen money from her victims. She destroyed their relationships with their children through systematic psychological manipulation. Children were turned against their fathers through carefully planted suggestions of abuse and neglect. Business partnerships were sabotaged through whispered accusations of incompetence and dishonesty. Entire social circles were poisoned against the targets through Linda's masterful manipulation of sympathy and outrage. She's a one-woman hurricane, Raphael reported during their final briefing. Everywhere she goes, families and businesses are destroyed while she walks away richer and ready to start again. But Greg's investigation had revealed something else. Linda had never faced real consequences for her crimes. The men she destroyed had been too broken or too dead to pursue justice. Law enforcement agencies in different states had never connected the cases. She'd operated with impunity for 15 years, leaving a trail of devastation that stretched across the country. That was about to change. Greg arranged a meeting with Agent Levine and Detective Farley, presenting them with Raphael's complete investigation into Linda's criminal history. The evidence showed a clear pattern of interstate fraud, identity theft, and racketeering that gave federal prosecutors everything they needed to file additional charges. This is incredible work, Agent Levine said, studying the case files. We can tie her to at least 8 separate federal crimes across 5 states. She's looking at multiple life sentences even before we factor in her role with the whole conspiracy. There's something else, Greg said. She's been using the money from these crimes to fund other criminal enterprises. The shell companies Chad created weren't just washing money for Pablo Pollard. They were also laundering Linda's profits from marriage fraud operations. The revelation expanded the federal investigation yet again. Linda hadn't just been Chad's accomplice. She'd been running her own parallel criminal organization that used Hull Construction as a financial clearinghouse for multiple illegal enterprises. But Greg's most satisfying discovery came from an unexpected source. During the investigation, Raphael had interviewed several of Linda's previous victims' children, now adults who'd spent years believing their fathers were abusive monsters. When presented with evidence of Linda's true nature, many began to question the stories they'd been told. Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's eldest daughter, called Greg personally after learning about the investigation. "I hated my father for 10 years before he killed himself," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I believed every lie that woman told about him. Now I know she murdered him as surely as if she'd pulled the trigger herself." Greg arranged for Sarah and several other victims' children to meet with federal prosecutors. Their testimony about Linda's psychological manipulation tactics provided crucial evidence for racketeering charges that could ensure she never had the opportunity to destroy another family. The web of corruption was finally being unraveled completely. Chad faced life in federal prison for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The bribes to city officials had triggered a wider investigation that implicated dozens of contractors and government employees in a pay-to-play scheme that had been operating for years. Pablo Pollard's organization was being systematically dismantled as federal agents used Hull Construction's records to trace money laundering operations across the entire criminal network. Pollard himself had been arrested in a spectacular raid that yielded enough evidence to eliminate his organization permanently. But for Greg, the most important victory was Linda's complete destruction. She'd spent 15 years believing herself untouchable, superior to the men she'd manipulated and destroyed. Now she faced the rest of her life in federal prison, her true identity exposed, her criminal empire dismantled, her victims finally receiving justice. As Greg signed the final papers returning Hull Construction to legitimate operation, he reflected on the 4-year journey from homeless disgrace to victorious heir. The company his grandfather had built would survive and prosper, clean of the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. The fallen prince had reclaimed his throne, but more importantly, he'd ensure that the predators who tried to destroy his family would face consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, he'd learned, was indeed just accounting, and the books were finally balanced. Chapter 7. The Final Reckoning. 6 months after Chad's arrest, Greg stood in the federal courthouse watching his brother shuffle into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. The man who'd once commanded board meetings and political fundraisers now looked like a broken shell, his face gaunt from months of protective custody and his eyes constantly darting toward the gallery where Pablo Pollard's associates might be sitting. Judge Margie Allison, a no-nonsense veteran of the federal bench, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. Money laundering, racketeering conspiracy, bribery of public officials, tax evasion, and fraud, 23 separate federal charges that carried a combined maximum sentence of over 300 years. Chad's attorney, a harried public defender named Shane Jimenez, had already negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for his cooperation against other members of the conspiracy, Chad would receive a sentence of 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. "Mr. Hull," Judge Allison addressed Chad directly, "do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting guilt to all charges and waiving your right to appeal?" Chad's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that your cooperation with federal investigators has placed you in considerable personal danger?" "Yes, Your Honor." Greg felt no satisfaction watching his brother's humiliation. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices Chad had made over years of criminal behavior. Justice didn't require Greg's emotional investment, only his commitment to seeing truth revealed and consequences enforced. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims of Chad's crimes, and federal agents who'd spent months unraveling the conspiracy. Near the front sat Sarah Webb and 3 other children of Linda's previous victims, finally witnessing accountability for the woman who destroyed their families. Linda herself, no longer pretending to be Lynette Hull, would face sentencing the following week. Her trial had been a media sensation, with prosecutor Gail Simons methodically presenting evidence of 15 years of marriage fraud, identity theft, and psychological manipulation. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding her guilty on all 47 federal charges. But today belonged to Chad's reckoning. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Allison continued, "I want to address the impact of your crimes on the community and your family. The corruption you facilitated damaged public trust in government institutions. The money laundering operation you enabled supported drug trafficking and violence that harmed countless innocent people. And your betrayal of family trust destroyed relationships that can never be fully repaired. Chad stood motionless as the judge's words washed over him. Greg wondered if his brother truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done, or if he still saw himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. However, the judge added, "Your cooperation has been substantial and valuable. Federal agents have indicated that your information led to the arrest and conviction of 37 additional defendants and a seizure of over $40 million in criminal assets." The cooperation had come at a cost. Pablo Pollard's organization had put a bounty on Chad's head that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even in federal prison, he needed protective custody to survive. "Chad Hull," Judge Allison announced, "I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison to be served in protective custody. You will also pay restitution of $12 million to victims of your crimes and forfeit all assets obtained through illegal activities." Chad swayed slightly as the sentence was imposed, but remained standing. Greg watched his brother's shoulders slump in acceptance of his fate, a quarter-century in a 6x8 cell, constantly looking over his shoulder for enemies who would never forgive his betrayal. As Chad was led away, Greg felt Detective Farley's hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud," Farley said quietly. "Justice was served here today." Greg nodded, but said nothing. Harold Hull's ghost could rest knowing that his company's honor had been restored and his true heir vindicated, but pride seemed like the wrong emotion for this moment. The following week brought Linda's sentencing, which proved even more dramatic than Chad's. She'd refused all plea agreements, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her trial had revealed the full scope of her predatory career, with victim after victim testifying about the devastation she'd caused. Judge Allison's sentencing speech was scathing. "Linda Henderson, you have spent 15 years destroying families through systematic manipulation and fraud. You have shown no remorse for your crimes and no recognition of the suffering you've caused. Your actions represent a level of calculated cruelty that demands the severest response." Linda received 4 consecutive life sentences plus 60 years, ensuring she would die in federal prison regardless of appeals or good behavior. The woman who believed herself untouchable was removed from society permanently. As the courtroom cleared after Linda's sentencing, Greg found himself alone with Raphael Owen, who'd been instrumental in documenting the evidence that made justice possible. "Any regrets?" Raphael asked. Greg considered the question carefully. "I regret that it took 4 years for the truth to surface. I regret that other people were hurt by their crimes. But I don't regret that they're facing consequences for their choices." "What about forgiveness?" "Some people would say you have an obligation to forgive family. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and genuine remorse," Greg replied. "Chad spent 4 years destroying my life through lies and manipulation. Linda spent 15 years destroying multiple families for profit. Neither has shown any remorse for their actions, only anger being caught." Raphael nodded thoughtfully. "What's next for you?" Greg looked out the courthouse window at the city where he'd been born, fallen from grace, and ultimately reclaimed his place. Hull Construction was thriving under his leadership, its reputation restored through transparent operations and ethical business practices. The company was currently building low-income housing projects and veterans rehabilitation centers, causes that would have horrified Chad's profit-obsessed worldview. "I rebuild what they tried to destroy," Greg said finally. "Not just the business, but the trust and integrity that should define the Hull name." 6 months later, Greg stood in the restored Hull Construction headquarters, looking at photographs of 3 generations of Hull men who'd built the company from nothing. His grandfather's portrait showed a man who'd started with a single concrete truck and built an empire through honest work and fair dealing. His father showed a leader who'd expanded that empire while maintaining the family's reputation for integrity. Greg's own portrait, recently commissioned, showed a man who'd learned that true strength came not from avoiding adversity, but from surviving it with principles intact. The company now employed over 200 people and had contracts worth $40 million, all of it legitimate business based on competitive bidding and quality work. Greg had established a charitable foundation that supported victims of domestic fraud and psychological manipulation, ensuring that Linda's future victims would have resources for recovery and justice. He'd never married again, though several women had expressed interest in the wealthy, eligible bachelor who'd overcome such dramatic adversity. Trust, once broken so completely, was difficult to rebuild even with innocent people. But Greg had found peace in solitude and purpose in his work. Every successful project, every ethical business deal, every family helped by his foundation represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy him. The fallen prince had not just reclaimed his throne. He'd proven himself worthy of it through trials that would have broken a lesser man. And unlike the fairy tales, this story ended not with forgiveness and reconciliation, but with justice served and accounts balanced. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness. Some crimes demanded consequences that lasted a lifetime. Greg Hull had learned that mercy without justice was merely weakness, and that true strength sometimes required the courage to walk away from those who'd proven themselves unworthy of redemption. In the end, the price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally rest knowing that the dead were avenged and the living were protected from predators who'd learned too late that some men could not be broken, only strengthened by the trials they endured. Chapter 8. The Network's End. 1 year after the trials, Greg received an unexpected visitor at his office. Agent Kirsten Levine arrived with a thick file folder and the satisfied expression of someone who just closed a career-defining case. "The Pablo Pollard investigation is officially complete," she announced, setting the folder on Greg's desk. "I thought you'd want to see the final numbers." Greg opened the file to find a comprehensive summary of the criminal network's destruction. Pollard himself was serving life without parole after his organization's money laundering operation was exposed through Hull Construction's records. 63 associates had been arrested, tried, and convicted on various federal charges. Over $80 million in criminal assets have been seized and returned to victims. "Your brother's cooperation was instrumental," Agent Levine continued. Despite the personal danger, he provided information that led to arrests across 5 states and 2 countries. Greg felt no warmth toward Chad, despite his cooperation. Fear of Pablo Pollard's revenge had motivated his brother's assistance, not genuine remorse for his crimes. Chad was serving his sentence in protective custody at a federal prison in Colorado, where he would remain for the next 24 years. "What about the city corruption cases?" Greg asked. "Complete victory there as well. Terry McKee and Hugh Higgins both received 15-year sentences. The investigation expanded to include 12 other city employees who were taking bribes or kickbacks. The entire planning and zoning department has been restructured with new oversight procedures." The corruption cases have been personally satisfying for Greg, who'd watched honest contractors struggle to compete against companies that bought their approvals through bribes. Hull Construction's current success was built on merit rather than corruption, a fact that made every victory more meaningful. But the most important update concerned Linda Henderson's appeals. She exhausted her final appeal last month, Agent Levine reported. The Supreme Court declined to hear her case. She'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison, and her conviction has inspired investigations in 12 other states where she operated under different identities. Greg nodded grimly. Justice delayed was justice denied, but justice served completely was something approaching closure. "There's one more thing," Agent Levine added, pulling out a smaller file. "We recovered additional assets hidden in offshore accounts Linda established under various false identities. The total comes to just over $6 million. Restitution for her victims? Already distributed. Marcus Webb's children received substantial settlements, as did the families of her other victims. Your testimony about her psychological manipulation tactics was crucial in securing those judgments." Greg had testified at several victim restitution hearings, describing Linda's methods and the long-term damage she'd caused through systematic psychological abuse. Seeing the relief on victims' families' faces had been more satisfying than any financial compensation. After Agent Levine left, Greg walked through Hull Construction's offices, observing the honest work being done by people who'd rebuilt their careers after Chad's criminal leadership. Stuart Gleason had been promoted to chief financial officer after proving his integrity during the federal investigation. Amanda Chung had implemented ethics training programs that ensured future corruption would be impossible. The company's current projects reflected Greg's values rather than Chad's greed. They were building affordable housing for veterans, renovating schools in low-income neighborhoods, and constructing a new hospital wing that would serve the city's most vulnerable populations. Every project was bid competitively and completed within budget, restoring the whole name's reputation for excellence and integrity. That evening, Greg visited his father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone read simply, Harold Hull, 1951 to 2024, beloved father and businessman. No mention of the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his legacy, only acknowledgement of the man who'd ultimately chosen truth over comfort. "It's finished, Dad," Greg said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the grave. "The company is clean, the criminals are in prison, and justice has been served. You can rest now." A light rain began to fall as Greg walked back to his car, washing the dust from his father's headstone and the courthouse steps where Chad and Linda had been sentenced. The city looked different now, cleaner somehow, as if the removal of corruption had allowed honest growth to flourish. Greg's phone buzzed with a text from Raphael Owen. "Pollard found dead in his cell this morning. Apparent suicide, but federal investigators are treating it as suspicious. Thought you should know." Greg deleted the message without responding. Pablo Pollard's death, whether suicide or murder, was justice of a different kind. The inevitable result of a criminal lifestyle that made enemies of everyone who mattered. Greg felt no satisfaction in the crime boss's demise, only relief that another dangerous predator had been permanently removed from society. The rain intensified as Greg drove through the city center, past the construction sites where Hull construction crews were building legitimately acquired projects, past the courthouse where justice had been served through proper legal channels, past the homeless shelter where Greg had once slept, now renovated with funds from his charitable foundation. For years ago, he'd been a broken man who'd lost everything through others' lies and manipulations. Tonight, he was a successful businessman who'd restored his family's honor through patience, planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. The fallen prince had become something better than royalty. He'd become a man who understood that true power came from integrity rather than corruption, from justice rather than revenge, from building rather than destroying. His enemies were imprisoned or dead, their criminal networks dismantled, their victims compensated. The accounts were balanced, the books closed, the story complete. Greg Hull drove home through the rain, satisfied that he'd proven the most important truth of all. Some men could be broken by betrayal, but others were only strengthened by it, tempered like steel in the fire of adversity until they became unbreakable instruments of justice. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, and Greg Hull could finally move forward knowing that the innocent were protected and the guilty had faced consequences that matched their crimes. Justice, after all, was just accounting, and these books were permanently closed. Chapter 9. Legacy of Justice. 5 years after Harold Hull's funeral, Greg stood on the balcony of his penthouse office, looking out over a city transformed by the removal of systemic corruption. Hull Construction had become the region's largest employer, with over 500 employees working on projects that serve the community rather than criminal enterprises. The company's motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, read simply, "Built on truth, founded on honor." The transformation hadn't been easy. Rebuilding trust after Chad's criminal leadership had required years of transparent operations, ethical business practices, and community engagement. Every contract was bid openly, every project completed within budget, every employee held to the highest standards of integrity. Greg's secretary, Nina Gill, knocked on his door, carrying the morning's mail and newspapers. At 62, Nina had worked for Hull Construction for 30 years, surviving both Chad's criminal period and the company's rebirth under Greg's leadership. "The morning papers," she said, setting down copies of local and national publications. "You might want to see the front page of the Tribune." The headline read, "Hull Construction wins National Ethics Award for Business Excellence." The article described Greg's transformation of the company from criminal enterprise to community pillar, highlighting the charitable foundation's work with fraud victims and the company's commitment to rebuilding trust through transparent operations. 5 years ago, Hull Construction was synonymous with corruption and scandal, the article stated. Today, under Greg Hull's leadership, it represents the highest standards of business ethics and community service. This remarkable transformation demonstrates that redemption is possible even after the most serious betrayals of public trust. Greg set the paper aside without reading the full article. Media attention made him uncomfortable, but he understood its value in demonstrating that legitimate business could be more successful than criminal enterprises. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Webb, Marcus Webb's daughter, who became a victims' rights advocate after her father's vindication, saw the article. "Dad would be proud that his death led to something positive. Thank you for making sure Linda paid for what she did to all of us." Similar messages have been arriving all morning from victims' families, former employees, and community leaders who'd watched Greg's methodical restoration of his family's reputation. The fallen prince had become something unexpected, a symbol of redemption through justice rather than forgiveness. But the most significant message came from an unexpected source. "Mr. Hull," Nina said, returning with a formal letter bearing federal letterhead. "This just arrived by special courier." The letter was from Agent Levine, now promoted to supervise the FBI's white-collar crime division. "Dear Mr. Hull, I wanted to inform you personally that Linda Henderson died in federal prison yesterday evening. Official cause of death was complications from cancer, though she'd been refusing treatment for several months. She maintained her innocence until the end and expressed no remorse for her crimes. Her death closes the final chapter on one of the most complex fraud cases in federal history. 15 families received justice because of your courage in exposing her true nature and providing evidence of her criminal pattern. The investigative techniques developed during her case have been used to identify and prosecute 17 other marriage fraud predators operating across the country. Chad Hull remains in protective custody and has reportedly found religion during his incarceration. He's expressed interest in speaking with you, though I understand if you prefer to maintain no contact. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished. Justice served through proper channels is always preferable to vigilante revenge, and your commitment to legal processes helped ensure that dangerous criminals faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Respectfully, Agent Kirsten Levine. Greg folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer alongside other correspondence from the various legal proceedings. Linda's death felt like the closing of a book he'd never asked to read, a final punctuation mark on a story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. He'd felt no satisfaction when Chad was sentenced, no triumph when Linda received life imprisonment, and no pleasure in learning of her death. Justice wasn't about emotional catharsis. It was about ensuring that consequences matched choices and that society was protected from those who'd proven themselves dangerous. That afternoon, Greg received another unexpected visitor. Stuart Gleason, now Hull Construction's chief financial officer, knocked on his door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Greg, you need to see this," Stuart said, spreading financial reports across the conference table. "We just closed the biggest quarter in company history. Legitimate profits, ethical practices, competitive bidding, everything your grandfather would have wanted." The numbers were impressive. Hull Construction's annual revenue had reached $75 million, surpassing even the inflated figures from Chad's criminal period. More importantly, every dollar had been earned honestly through quality work and fair dealing. "There's something else," Stewart continued. "The Veterans Rehabilitation Center we built last year has been nominated for a National Architecture Award. The low-income housing project received recognition from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We're not just successful, we're making a difference. Greg studied the reports with satisfaction. Success built on integrity was more valuable than wealth obtained through corruption, though it had taken years to prove that principle in practice. As the afternoon wore on, Greg found himself thinking about Chad's request for a meeting. His brother had been imprisoned for 5 years, serving his sentence in protective custody while helping federal investigators dismantle the remains of Pablo Pollard's organization. By all accounts, he'd become a model prisoner who'd found religion and expressed remorse for his crimes. But remorse offered after punishment was meaningless. Chad's cooperation with authorities had been motivated by fear rather than conscience, and his conversion in prison was likely another manipulation designed to improve his circumstances. Greg had learned that forgiveness required genuine repentance, while justice demanded that consequences match choices. Chad had chosen betrayal, corruption, and criminality. He would serve his full sentence regardless of his current claims of redemption. That evening, Greg attended the annual Hull Foundation Charity Gala, an event that raised money for victims of financial fraud and domestic abuse. The ballroom was filled with business leaders, politicians, and community activists who'd supported his efforts to restore the Hull name's reputation. The keynote speaker was Dr. Amanda Chung, who'd left her psychology practice to become a full-time advocate for fraud victims. Her speech focused on the long-term psychological damage caused by financial predators and the importance of legal accountability in the healing process. Justice delayed is justice denied, she said, but justice served completely allows victims to reclaim their lives and trust in social institutions. The Hull Foundation exists because Greg Hull understood that protecting future victims is more important than satisfying past grievances. The foundation had grown beyond Greg's initial vision. It now operated victim support centers in 12 states, provided legal assistance for fraud prosecutions, and funded research into the psychological techniques used by financial predators. Last year alone, it had helped convict 43 marriage fraud criminals and recovered over $20 million for their victims. As the gala concluded, Greg reflected on the journey from homeless disgrace to community leader. The fallen prince had discovered that true nobility came not from inherited position, but from earned respect, not from avoiding adversity, but from overcoming it with principles intact. His enemies were imprisoned or dead, their criminal networks dismantled, their victims compensated and protected. The Hull name represented honor rather than corruption, service rather than exploitation, justice rather than revenge. Greg had never remarried, never had children, never built the traditional family that might have motivated different choices. But he built something more lasting, a legacy of integrity that would survive long after he was gone. The accounts were balanced, the books permanently closed, the story complete. Greg Hull had proven that some betrayals created strength rather than weakness, that justice served properly was more satisfying than revenge, and that the price of betrayal, once paid in full, allowed the innocent to move forward while the guilty faced consequences that matched their crimes. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was justice. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.